Previously on the American Justice Podcast.
How big was the dagger?
Probably,
six. The blade 6 inches.
The blade was probably 6-7 inches, and then the handle 4 or 5.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system: the prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Pogensey.
Welcome back, AJ Army. Boy, have we been through a lot together. I can't believe the end to Season 1 is right there in sight. It has been a pleasure and a delight to bring this story to you. The reaction we've received from almost every single one of you has been nothing but supportive and encouraging. I hope that we are together for many, many more seasons to come. Okay, before we get started, I want to insert a personal note. Something happened this weekend that will forevermore affect the criminal justice system in this country. And seeing that we are a podcast about the criminal justice system, I feel it's appropriate to mention it. As many, if not all of you are aware, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away this last Friday, September 18th, 2020. I found out as I was wrapping up the final edits on this episode. Needless to say that the loss of any Supreme Court justice is a huge deal. There are, after all, only 9. A case can be made that federal-level circuit court justices are more important, but ultimately, whenever a case cannot be settled in a lower court, of course, it ends up in the Supreme Court. Now, in case you didn't know, and as you'll find out in a few weeks, when we talk about the status of Brandon's case, the Supreme Court ultimately only hears about 1 to 2% of the cases that are appealed to it. That's why the appointment of federal circuit court judges are so important. However, with that said, Justice Ginsburg was a champion for many different sectors of the country. You see, in the 1970s, the notorious RBG, as she later came to be known, was a lawyer for the ACLU, and her main job was arguing sex discrimination cases. I know it might be hard for some of you to believe, but women were very much discriminated against back then, even more than they are today. But RBG's plan was as much ruthless as it was cunning. She flipped the script on the all-male Supreme Court when she was arguing. She made it all about sexual discrimination of men. What a genius. Here's an excerpt from the Esquire magazine issue released on Sunday. Quote, "What's even more remarkable, though, is the cunning strategy she used throughout those cases to convince an all-male court that discriminating on the basis of sex was not only wrong, but in violation of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees equal protection to all citizens under the law. To do so, she presented men, not women, as the ultimate victims of sex discrimination. Her logic being that, quote, almost every discrimination that operates against males operates against females as well, end quote. In one case, a widower was denied survivor benefits based on a Social Security provision that assumed women were secondary providers with unimportant incomes. Weinsberger versus Weisenfeld, 1975. In another case, a husband of a female lieutenant in the Air Force was refused military benefits based on the assumption that a man was not likely to be the dependent spouse. Frontiero versus Richardson, 1973. In both cases, Ginsburg argued on behalf of the men and won. But women won too, by challenging laws that were based on outdated stereotypes of women. Ginsburg expanded the roles available to women in American society. Thanks to Ginsburg, the courts no longer assumed that women weren't capable of being primary providers or heads of their households. Alongside Justice Ginsburg's victories came an increased understanding within the Supreme Court that any discrimination based on sex must be scrutinized at a higher level. That understanding was eventually codified in 1976 in Craig versus Boren. In that case, which Ms. Ginsburg worked on, the Supreme Court struck down an Oklahoma law that allowed women to buy beer at age 18, but forbade men from doing so until they were 21. By striking down the law, the justices, reluctantly or not, admitted that the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection under the law extended to equality of the sexes. End quote. Needless to say, the woman was a force to be reckoned with, and she will be missed. Rest in peace, Notorious RBG. Rest in peace. All right, so to start things off this week, we have a little bit of housekeeping to discuss. First, I think I promised you last week that we would start off this week with discussing the phone records. However, I ran into a bit of a snag. While going over everything one more time just to make sure that I could present it to you in an organized way for you to see exactly how everyone interacted with each other in the days surrounding the murders, what ended up happening was I found something that I hadn't realized before. I mean, you can go over this stuff 100 times, and it's usually on the 101st time that you end up realizing something that was right in front of your face the whole time. Well, when I was going over everyone's records, I found something very peculiar in Charla's, Dustin's, and Mike's calls that I had never realized before. And unfortunately for this podcast, it's something that may actually be useful in Brandon's appeal. Which means, guess what? Yep, I have to approve it through Brandon's attorneys before I can talk about it publicly. This means that unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go over the phone records this week. However, we'll move on with the trial, and then we'll probably end up wrapping up the episodes about the trial with the phone records. There's a lot we can talk about, but I definitely need to make sure that nothing I say publicly can or will interfere with Brandon's appeal. I'm sure you understand. The second thing we need to discuss before getting to the continuation of the trial is that this podcast is going to once again be extended by one episode. The reason for this is that when C. Derek and I were going over the closing arguments and trying to explain them to you, I just realized that I would never be able to do them justice by just talking about them or summarizing them. So what I decided to do was get the actual transcript of the closing arguments recorded with voiceover artists, and we're just going to play the closing arguments for you, word for word. That way, you don't have to take my interpretation of the state's position. You can hear it straight from their mouths. So after our 4 episodes about the trial, we'll have one whole episode dedicated to the closing arguments and the verdict. Then we'll finish up with the episode on the appeals and then the wrap-up. So there we have it. let's get started with the state of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff. Continuation of Day 7, Court Reporter, Volume 46. Okay, so a man by the name of Jerry LaBerteaux comes to the stand. There's a bit of stumbling over his last name because of the crazy Cajun pronunciation, but they eventually get past it. And I thought Adrian Lingy was hard, or Lingy, however the hell she says it. Anyway, we'll call him Jerry. He introduces himself as an engineer with AT&T, and in 2009, that was considered an impressive title. Maybe it still is in 2020, but most kindergartners of today erupted from the womb working technology, and most of them better than me. Anyway, old Jerry has a side gig of interpreting phone calls for juries in court cases. Was AT&T just not cutting the mustard in the salary department? Anyway, still impressive for 2009 standards, mustard or not. He tells us what we've already discussed a dozen or so times. The phone records are incomplete due to the different carriers, and it proves nothing. Cha-ching, Jerry. Job well done. Next up, Hunt County investigator and current sheriff-elect Terry Jones takes the stand. If you remember, he was present during the interviews of both Brandon and Charla Woodruff. You have been paying attention, right? The prosecutors hand out transcripts of those interviews, and the jury follows along as they watch. The jury had been treated like preschoolers up until this point, so I'm sure a few of them were sad that there were no pictures in the handouts. Imagine the prosecution pausing at every turn of the page just to point them out like they do, just before nap time. Now here, ladies and gentlemen, is a black page. This is actually a photo of Ranger Collins doing it with the lights off. All right, back to the trial. Jones claims that he had never worked any of the crime scenes or even watched the videos. Basically, he didn't follow up on anything said in the interviews, regardless of how trivial, because Jeffrey Collins was doing a bang-up job. Please lead by example, soon to be Sheriff Jones. I don't want to have another podcast season dedicated to your antics 10 years from now. Now, the jurors are allowed to watch a television interview conducted with Brandon Woodruff on Dallas Channel 11 News from 2005. It's never mentioned in the court transcript, but I hope it didn't include any of those 2005 commercials with the creepy Burger King guy.
I love magic and food that's fun. I doubt it.
I swear, those haunt me to this day. Russell Looney now comes to the stand. Remember the fellow who was supposed to be meeting with Dennis and Norma about some barn money? Yeah, that would be this guy. He'd done some work for the Woodruffs in the past, but it was rumored that there was some bad blood between him and Dennis. Brandon claimed that he was supposed to visit on the night of the murders to collect what was owed him. Well, it was either the barn guy or the fence guy. He wasn't really sure, but crackpot investigator Ranger Collins sure did try to figure it out, didn't he? Not really. So Mr. Looney claimed he'd been paid in full for the work on the barn and that Dennis was a, quote, great guy. He also said that he had cashed the check on Friday the 14th of October. This was verified by the bank, and the check did say paid in full. So either it was really the fence guy and not the barn guy, or he was supposed to come out there to discuss further work. This is one of those subjects that was never really decided completely, and what should be no surprise to you by now, wasn't really followed up on. I mean, sure, they asked him, did you go out there to see Dennis that Sunday? But when he said no, they left it at that. No follow-up questions, no checking with neighbors to see if they saw them, Nothing like that. I hope I didn't shock you too much with that information. Mr. Looney also said that there had been no disagreements between the two of them, and he never heard from Dennis Woodruff again after cashing the check. Well, none of us did, Russell. None of us did. I think I would have investigated this guy just a bit further rather than taking him for his word. But then again, maybe I've watched too much Perry Mason, and I consider everyone to be a potential suspect. All right, next up to the plate, Joy Sandstrom. Who is she, and why are you just now hearing about her for the very first time? Well, get used to it, ladies and gentlemen. There are a ton of people in this trial that you'll be meeting for the very first time. She's Russell Looney's ex-wife. I can't imagine why she couldn't wait to drop that last name. You'd have to be Looney to keep it. Still, the prosecution had to cover all their bases, unlike the investigators, and she had basically repeated Russell's testimony word for word. It's easy to do when you've got a few years to prepare for the inevitable. Remember what body language expert Susan Constantine said?
People will bolster, they'll exaggerate, they may not remember facts, and you have to remember that what happened here, and 9 days later, a truthful person is not going to remember everything verbatim. In fact, I'd be more concerned about someone that did remember everything verbatim.
Next, Pam Hoffman takes the stand. Man, we're really beginning to reach here when it comes to potential witnesses. If you recall, and I'm sure you barely do, she cut Brandon's hair once. Yep, just once. She was the hairstylist who colored and cut Brandon's hair at the mall in Texarkana shortly after the bodies were discovered, but before the funeral. If you'll recall, we touched on Ms. Hoffman earlier in the season when we talked about why Brandon was coloring his hair back to his more natural blonde color. It was his grandmother's idea. She didn't like the black and wanted it to look better for the funeral. Also, if any of you have tried doing this in your life, you would know that going from black all the way to blonde in one sitting never goes well. Because of this, as Miss Ferguson talked about earlier in the season as well, Brandon did look a little weird. His hair definitely did not look like what it usually looked like for most of his life. Did this have any influence on Ranger Collins's dislike of Brandon? Nah, probably not. It was definitely the gay thing. All right, so Miss Hoffman testified that she recalled that his hair was black when she met him, and he requested it to be what she called, quote, paper white. Before Brandon could even really open his mouth to her, Brandon's grandmother wanted her to know that his parents had just been murdered. Ms. Hoffman claimed that Brandon talked a lot about the money that he and Charla would inherit from the deaths of Dennis and Norma. He went on to explain that he believed people from Texarkana were slow and all the people in his aunt's house were wearing on his nerves. When she met Charla, she claimed the distraught daughter was crying and had recently passed out in front of JCPenney's. Odd. I passed out many times unexpectedly in college, but never at a JCPenney's. Must have been a Chili's next door. Happy hour, margaritas always got me. Still, you got to pour it on thick to establish those sympathy alibis, right? I mean, as we all know, it was Charla's thing to pass out. Remember her diagnosis of psychosomatic seizures? Yep, the ones that have absolutely nothing to do with your physiology and basically is just caused by you craving attention? Yep. Turns out this was one of those. As you'll hear when Charla takes the stand, though, she completely denies ever passing out in JCPenney's. It's unfortunate that this witness was given so much weight with the jury, because through my investigation, I have actually uncovered something that explains why Miss Hoffman was lying. She was actually friends with one of the shit kickers. Man, talk about a small world. Who would have thunk? Turns out she had a motive to lie, and lie she did. She believed that Brandon killed his parents, and she was going to do her part to make sure that none of the shit kickers were looked at anymore. So she then says that Brandon's hair took 4 hours long, and she says that he talked about money the whole time. She also claimed that he showed no remorse, and she actually admitted that she believed that he was responsible for the deaths of Dennis and Norma. Nothing like a good bit of hairstylist psychology to keep this trial chugging along. Okay, so speaking of the devil, next up, Charla Woodruff takes the stand. The moment we've all been waiting for. Or at least the moment I've been waiting for. Quick spoiler for you. She didn't pass out on the stand, and there's not a Chili's in the basement of the Hunt County Courthouse. I know. I looked. Charla says at this time, in 2009, she'd made the detective at Miller County Sheriff's Department, but never finished college. Miller County is the county seat for Texarkana, Arkansas. Okay, let's stop right there. I have to let you know right now that one of the most mysterious facts in this case to me is how in the hell did they let Charla carry a gun and a badge? I mean, seriously, do they not do psychological background checks in Miller County, Arkansas? There have been all kinds of rumors floating around about how Charla got a job with the sheriff's department, something about relationships with certain investigators and Texas Rangers, and if they had a hand in getting her hired. But I can't go into those because those are just rumors. What I can tell you, though, is something that we know is fact. Remember the two so-called attorneys that sat in on Charla's and Brandon's interviews? Yeah, you know, the potted plants just sitting there. Remember them? Their names were Leroy Autry and Leroy Wren Autry, father and son. Well, guess who just happens to be the district court judge for Miller County? Yep, you guessed it, Wren Autry. Wow, this world just keeps getting smaller and smaller. Perhaps a few well-earned letters of recommendation were slipped under the sheriff's door. Who knows at this point? But can you imagine giving someone with Charla's psychiatric background a gun and a badge? It just baffles my mind. Hopefully, she doesn't pass out while trying to arrest a suspect. All right, the prosecution takes the sympathy road, stating that Charla was diagnosed with meningitis in September of 2005 and had been admitted to the hospital shortly before her parents' murders. Oddly enough, none of this was mentioned in any of the interviews in 2005, and it did not prevent her from drinking it up in those few days between turning down a conversation with her mother and wishing that she hadn't. She claimed that Dennis and Norma came to visit her in the hospital and purchased all kinds of cleaning supplies for her apartment. Hell, it was even mentioned that Norma cleaned her apartment for her. What a mom. What in the hell does this have to do with the murder trial? Oh yeah, that's right. She claimed that that day was the last time that she saw her mother alive. Charla said that Brandon hated the fact that his parents were moving into a trailer home. He thought it was beneath them. She also claimed that Brandon got whatever he wanted, and all she got was a $500 limit credit card and a gas card. Maybe we need to call her a wambulance. Okay. Charla goes on to say that she was babysitting for her Aunt Kathy on the weekend in question, and the train derailed in Texarkana, causing a huge evacuation. My question is, what was Charla doing near the railroad tracks? I mean, what's next? Brandon caused the train to derail from 150 miles away? She went back to Magnolia and attempted to play phone tag with her parents for a couple of days. After their deaths, she was informed of the cause by a television news reporter who caught her at the front door of the Heath house. She stuck by the fact that Brandon was never allowed to drive Norma's truck and that he always got what he wanted from Dennis and Norma by just bugging them. At least Brandon never said his mommy had to clean his dorm room. Regardless of what we've been told by others, she said Norma Etherington and her mother were best of friends and never argued about anything. Everyone in Rockwall County, Texas, begged to differ. It has always boggled my mind why everyone that I've talked to that knew both of them would say that towards the end, Norma and Norma were pretty much diabolical enemies. Yet Charla made them out to be best friends who frolicked in the park together, tossing daisies out of a basket while they skipped around, smiling at each other with the soundtrack of Sound of Music playing in the background. But for whatever reason, Charla portrayed to the jury that she saw it differently than everyone else. When it was all said and done, she received some of the life insurance money, fixed up her parents' land, and took ownership of her mom's truck. She claimed to hate driving it because her mother wouldn't let her when she was alive, so she sold it. Wait, wasn't it supposed to be Brandon that wanted to sell off everything that their parents had? So after all the arguments, conflicts, and suspicions, she sold it. She's one industrial accident away from being a Marvel villain in my book for this reason alone. To make matters worse, she gets a sequel. Let's let the jurors go home and stew on that for a while until we see the remainder of Charla's testimony the next day. Day 8, State of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff. Court Reporter, Volume 47. Okay, here we go. Charla Woodruff testimony, Part 2. Oh, woe is me. Charla tells the courtroom that she attempted to commit suicide with a gun as a teenager because her family wouldn't let her go visit relatives over the Easter holiday. What in the actual fuck? Did the jury just sleep through this testimony? Every witness comes up there and says Brandon didn't like guns, didn't know how to shoot a gun, and had no idea if guns would even float. Yet Charla told them at age 14 she took a gun in her hand and tried to shoot herself. If this was a competition about who the crazier one was with a gun, she was definitely winning. Still, never looked at as the shooter. All right. Next, Charla moves on to describing her relationship with her parents. She talks about it as, quote, tough. Now, in a fun turn of events, defense attorney Katherine Ferguson reminds Charla that she claimed to, quote, play her parents every chance she got during her interview with Ranger Collins and Terry Jones. As a matter of fact, a lot of things she said on the stand was contradictory to her interview statements from 2005. She tries to play dumb about it, but the defense keeps making her read her own statements over and over again.
Okay, now you said that Brandon wasn't allowed to drive that truck except for going to a prom. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you recall telling something different for the Rangers?
No.
If I showed you your statement, a transcript of your statement to the Rangers, do you think that might refresh your recollection some?
Yes.
The second interview, pages 39 and 40. Now, Miss Woodruff, I'm going to have to show you these pages, and I don't want you to read them out loud to the jury. I just want you to read them to yourself, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And if you would start here at about line 19 on page 39, and just read down there to yourself, please, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Does that refresh your recollection, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
And you told the Rangers that you knew Brandon drove that you only drove the truck once, but that you knew Brandon drove it a lot more than you did. Isn't that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, in fact, didn't you tell the Rangers that as far as your parents were concerned, that you played them both to get what you wanted?
I don't know if I used the term to get what I wanted.
Well, would it refresh your recollection if I showed you your statement to the Rangers?
Yes, ma'am.
Does that refresh your recollection, ma'am?
Okay.
Is that a yes or a no?
Yes.
Okay, so you told them you played them both and you would get whatever you wanted either way.
Yes.
All right. Now you talked about the time that you attempted suicide when you were younger with a gun, and your parents kept guns out of the house afterwards. Is that correct?
No.
They kept guns in the house after you attempted suicide?
Yes, ma'am.
They kept a handgun there even though...
Yes, ma'am.
Well, do you remember telling the Rangers that after that episode that your father got rid of the gun and never owned one?
It was a couple of years later that he got rid of it.
Well, let me show you your statement to the Rangers, starting with line 24 there. If you read that, please, ma'am, to yourself.
Okay.
And didn't you tell the Rangers that after your suicide attempt, your father got rid of the gun very quickly?
Yes.
And that he hadn't owned a gun since?
Yes.
Okay. And how was his reaction? How was he handling the loss of your parents?
He hugged me. He seemed sad, but he never cried.
Never?
Not that night.
Did he ever cry between that night and the funeral?
Not that I observed.
Do you recall telling the Rangers that, asking about how your brother was taking this, and you told him that he cried a lot?
I don't remember saying that.
I'm going to show you on page 137 of your statement on October 23rd, 2005, to the Rangers, and again, read to yourself starting at line 22.
Okay.
And in response to the Ranger asking you how is your brother handling this, didn't you say he cries a lot?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think it would be strange if that morning someone had called the sheriff's office to provide information about your parents' death when no one even knew it was a murder?
No.
As a detective, would that strike you as a little strange?
Maybe.
Okay. Now, yesterday, you said you talked to your brother and that he told you he left at 6:30 on Sunday night. Do you remember testifying to that yesterday?
Yes.
Do you recall when you talked to the Rangers that you gave the Rangers a different time?
No.
Would it refresh your recollection to look at the statement for the Rangers?
Okay.
I'm going to show you on page 145 of your October 23rd statement, starting about line 20.
Okay.
And did you tell the Rangers that your brother told you he probably left at 7?
Yes.
Okay. So he seemed pretty hysterical and upset then, didn't he?
No.
Well, but you told the Rangers he was crying a lot, didn't you?
I wasn't around him a whole lot that week.
Uh-huh. But when you were interviewed back in October 23rd of 2005, you told the Rangers your brother was crying a lot, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. And you also recall that Brandon had a prize dog that somebody poisoned?
Yes.
And you all your family contacted the police about that, didn't they?
I don't remember.
Okay. Do you recall telling the Rangers that you filed a police report?
It's possible.
All right. Let me show you your statement. Just read to yourself starting there.
She finally claims that there were several things going on at her parents' house in Royce City that she wasn't aware of, and that she had rarely come home to visit and see for herself. Even holidays were spent with her relatives in Texarkana instead of with her parents in Royce City or Heath. Perhaps she was the one with an estranged relationship with Dennis and Norma. We'll never know. Unfortunately, Charla is excused from the stand long before I'd like her to be. But then again, she wasn't really needed. Everything anyone needed to know was already written in her interview transcripts from 3 years before. It was as though she was learning it all for herself for the very first time with an audience. Isn't that what she wanted? After the dramatic fiasco disguised as testimony, William Pardun, Brandon's old scorned cellmate and lifelong felon, takes the stand. The prosecution claims to everyone within earshot that no deals had been made in exchange for his testimony. Pardun insists that the two of them began forming a bond with each other and confiding in each other shortly after they met in the Hunt County Jail. Then, the prosecution lays out Pardun's criminal history for the jury to hear. Theft, larceny, and assault convictions filled up his rap sheet from as far back as the mid-1970s. Was he really the perfect witness to testify against someone who supposedly killed his parents and stole a truck? The investigators and prosecutors seemed to think so. He said that Brandon inquired as to whether a gun with wooden handles would float if thrown into a body of water. The prosecution explains to the jury that Brandon would have had to have crossed over Lake Ray Hubbard on Interstate 30 to get from the murder scene to the club he visited later that night. The defense then cross-examines him and reminds him that he's a car salesman by profession. Then Katherine says something that literally made me laugh out loud the first time I read it. So as soon as she says he's a used car salesman, she says, quote, "Okay, so you lie for a living, basically, is that right?" I don't know if Katherine checked to see if there were any used car salesmen on the jury, but as I said, she's quite a firecracker in the courtroom. The defense also reminds him that he officially stated that Brandon, quote, fucked up for having him removed from the cell that they were in together, and that he was going to get his revenge. His own history within the walls of the Hunt County Jail paints a completely different story than him being a model inmate. Luckily for him, he magically forgets everything that he said to Ranger Collins from his own statements, just like everyone else so far who's claimed that Brandon was guilty. I mean, at least he didn't pass out. I'll give him credit where credit is due. But don't worry, Katherine doesn't let him get away with these convenient memory lapses. She brings him right back to what he said to Ranger Collins. Now, just a quick sidetrack here if you don't mind. I know we talked earlier about Brandon asking if a gun with wooden handles would float, but I feel it's important to reiterate a couple things here. First, Brandon's attorneys had already told him that the police were alleging that it was a revolver/art piece stolen from the Lee's house that was used in the murders. They told him that it was a Colt .45 replica and had wooden handles. Again, this just shows how little Brandon knew about guns. You and I both know that this thing probably weighs at least 3 to 5 pounds, and there's absolutely no way in hell that it would float. But Brandon didn't know that. But don't let that stop the prosecution from drawing the conclusion that Brandon knew it was wooden handles because he was the one that stole it and shot his parents with it. Absolutely ridiculous. Also, one more thing that is quite suspicious about William Pardun's testimony. As we said, he was a 5 or 6 time felon. The 3 strikes and you're out rule should have applied in this case. As you'll hear in Katherine's closing, his sentence for the crime that he committed, which put him in the Hunt County Jail, should have been 25 years to life. He was in jail in Hunt County on a felony. Yet somehow he got probation. Probation. Let that sink in for just a minute. He got probation.
Because at first, I didn't have any inkling or any thoughts that he was that, I'm not going to say was or is, he's still innocent, was that type of person that would be capable of doing that type of crime because of his personality trait.
And what personality trait is that?
Well, timid, homosexual, and female.
Okay.
He's feminine. He
Okay.
shaves his legs, he shaves his arm, he shaves his chest. I mean, some weird shit.
He's doing that down there?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't do that shit in jail.
Okay.
But anyway, back to the gun deal. I was really intrigued about the gun because first it wasn't no spent cartridges, is what he said. And then, I said, well, if I was a shooter and I was going to do something with it, what would you do with the gun? I said, I'd throw it in the lake or something like that, And then that's when he said, well, I was in Plano. And I said, well, yeah, down there, throw it in the lake when you went across the bridge. He just shut up and didn't say nothing. We got back to talking, and then he asked me out of the blue, he said, would a gun with wooden handles float? And I just made me sit back and think, would it float? How stupid can you be? But then this kid is not what you call real common sense.
All right. Next up is Kathy Latch, sister to Dennis Woodruff and Brandon's aunt. She's basically Charla's babysitting alibi for the weekend in question. She tells the court that Dennis told her Brandon came out to him on the Sunday afternoon of the murders. Although he was cool with it, she claimed that Dennis was worried about that lifestyle because of potential diseases. She never heard another word from Dennis after that phone call, and she was the one responsible for driving to Magnolia to tell Charla of her parents' demise. Charla collapsed in pure Charla fashion. She also added that she praised Brandon for having his life together when the two of them met up in Texarkana before the funeral. She claimed he would have been a great support structure for Charla. That was about the time that one of her nurse friends started pumping Brandon full of Valium. According to some family members, Brandon was so inconsolable that they had to give him some Valium to calm him down. He also had some administered during the funeral when everyone claims that he had been acting wacky. Jumping to 2008, she would be the individual to find the magical dagger/sword/knife/impossible murder weapon. When the defense takes over, Kathy claims Dennis wasn't mad at all about Brandon's coming out, just sad and concerned. Wait, if she says Dennis was cool with it, what happened to the prosecution's theory that Brandon had a huge knockdown, drag-out fight with his parents when he came out to them? Oh, shit. Come on, Scott. Don't let a little thing like facts or logic interfere with a good murder mystery theory. Kathy also mentions Dennis saying that he wanted Brandon to stay far away from the Etherington family. He had caught Mike trespassing in their barn in the Heath house once and believed Mike was responsible for poisoning their animals. Remember that from the beginning of the season? We haven't spoken about Brandon's prized dog CJ that was poisoned with the antifreeze in a while. Well, turns out Dennis himself thought that shitkicker number one, Mike Etherington, was responsible. It's just one more thing that Brandon says that is backed up and corroborated by person after person after person. But Mike Etherington was trouble as far as Dennis Woodruff was concerned. Kathy also claimed that a neighbor to the Royce City home had told her about the trouble in the neighborhood. Gangs, shootings, break-ins happened all the time. Whoops, just one more thing that Brandon talked about now being backed up by other independent sources. Damn, I thought Brandon was such a liar. Oh well. Kathy also confirmed that really anyone had access to the barn that housed the magic dagger between the night of the murders and when the sword was discovered in 2008. No locks, no surveillance, nothing. So any shit kicker or anyone else could just mosey up on in there and let's say, put a 2-foot medieval looking sword on top of a box that they knew would be searched the next day. I'm not saying that that's exactly what happened, but Miss Latch is confirming that it could have happened. Ending out the day, Dr. Lynn Salzberger takes the stand. She was a medical examiner for the Southwest Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas in 2005. In her history as a medical examiner, she had performed over 3,000 autopsies. I'm sold on the credentials because that's a lot of death. She explains to the jury how an autopsy is conducted. Considering how the jury was so eager to put this 19-year-old fresh-faced kid in the electric chair just the week before, I'm sure some in this jury were drooling or at least had a minuscule amount of moisture collecting in the corner of their mouths. Dr. Salzberger explained a lot of what we've already talked about before. Dennis had 1 gunshot to the head and 9 stab wounds, etc. Although she claims the sword could have caused the same type of wounds that Dennis received, it's not conclusive. How irresponsible is this? Dr. Salzberger should have known what we all know, in that this sword could not have caused these type of stab wounds. However, as we're learning in the general public these days, it's amazing how these so-called scientists can't seem to agree on what the actual science says. If you don't believe me, just turn on The Innocence Files on Netflix. It talks about how some of the junk science is just that, junk. In fact, they brought up one study done by the American Society of Forensic Odontology, the association that certifies and credentials forensic odontologists. They are the ones that study and testify when there are bite marks on humans during trials. Anyway, they sent out a set of bite marks to over 1,000 forensic odontologists and asked them, are these human bite marks, or are they even bite marks at all? Not one set of bite marks had more than 60% agreement. That same disparagement occurs in stab wound analysis. And as you heard earlier, and as we'll discuss next week, Dr. Salzberger and the defense pathologist Dr. Carter could not disagree more. Dr. Salzberger also testified to the fact that Dennis had no defensive wounds, leading her to believe that the initial gunshot to the face did the trick. She says it would have paralyzed him instantly. The defense is just getting into it with her in regard to how the shape of the sword/dagger blade couldn't match the wounds received to his body when Judge Beacom interrupts Katherine Ferguson's cross and asks her how much longer she anticipates to cross-examine Dr. Salzberger because he has attorneys waiting in his chambers to take up some family emergencies. Man, it's gotta suck when a capital murder trial gets in the way of some man or woman trying to get their spouse kicked out of the house. But Judge Beacom says he's trying to get the good doctor out of there, but just wants to know how much longer Miss Ferguson anticipates having her testify. The prosecution interrupts and informs the court that Dr. Salzberger is unable to come back the following day because she's going out of town. So Katherine says, quote, "Well, Your Honor, it depends if I can get answers or not." The prosecution immediately objects. Quote, "That's inappropriate, Your Honor." Oh, I think it's completely appropriate. Here we are arguing about whether or not these stab wounds could have been caused by this sword, and Dr. Salzberger is not answering Miss Ferguson's questions. It's completely appropriate. It's truly at the crux of this whole case. If Miss Ferguson can convince just one juror that the sword/dagger could not have been the weapon that caused these wounds, that would have secured Brandon's freedom, or at the very least, a mistrial. It's completely appropriate. But Judge Beacom ends up taking a recess to go deal with his family stuff, and then when they come back, Katherine goes back and forth some more with Dr. Salzberger. She finally concedes that yes, there are a lot of knives out there that could have caused these wounds, but she refuses to give up on the fact that this sword would be included in those possibilities. Day 9, State of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff, Court Reporter, Volume 48. Lynn Salzberger's colleague, Sheila Spotswood, takes the stand. She is now the medical examiner for Collin County, Texas, and a specialist in forensic pathology. She was employed by Dallas County in 2005 and performed the autopsy on Norma Woodruff. Although Norma had 5 entrance wounds on her body, only 4 gunshots were examined. One went through her hand as a defensive wound and lodged itself inside of her body. Once again, we get a non-committal answer about the possibility that this sword could have caused the stab wounds. But of course, nothing was conclusive. The prosecution claimed the hair on Norma's hand was probably her own, but it was never tested to be sure. Spotswood wanted those hairs tested, but left it up to the good old Hunt County to request it. They never did. She even wrote on the autopsy report, quote, Norma's hair, ? They could have easily been tested, and if they were not Norma's hair, they would have definitely identified a true perpetrator. And as we know, as far as they're concerned, they had their fabricated number one suspect locked up since 2005. Why create more work for themselves? I will never understand why these hairs were not tested, and at the very goddamn least, keep them separate from the other hairs. Once again, the state of Texas fails Brandon Woodruff. Next to take the stand is Charles Clow from the Dallas Crime Lab. Basically, he teaches, quote, firearms for dummies to juries all over the state of Texas. He claimed the wounds found on Dennis and Norma were caused by a .45 caliber bullet. He also claimed that the bullets were what they call, quote, cowboy loads, and they are normally fired through a single-action revolver. Yes, that's the same kind of gun/art that the Lee family claimed to have missing from their home around the same time as the murders. He also claimed the weapon that fired these rounds was a Ruger. Now, according to my personal research, Ruger firearms weren't invented until 1949, which, if the weapon used in the crime was indeed the poor choice of wall art taken from the Lee family home, makes Michael Lee the poorest excuse for a cowboy enthusiast I've ever heard of. At what point does society begin referring to 1949 as the Wild Wild West? Never. That's when. The bullets, however, were cold hand loads. That's rather cowboyish, I guess. I'll negotiate for half-ass cowboy. How's that? Actually, the box of ammunition provided to the Hunt County Sheriff's Office by Michael Lee had many different types of bullets in it. Somehow, this meant something. The crime lab apparently had an extensive reference collection of handmade bullets, but Charles Clow said that he had never seen any bullets like the ones used to kill the Woodruffs. Since the gun was never found and no cartridge casings were delivered to the lab, no true ID of the weapon could be determined. He was also unable to determine if any of the bullets were fired from the same gun. Basically, he did no testing on the bullet fragments other than just to look at them and say, yep, they look like large caliber bullets to me. Absolutely ridiculous. All right. Can I get a drum roll, please? Finally, Ranger Sergeant Jeffrey T. Collins takes the stand. And a mighty stand it is. Our hero, ladies and gentlemen. If this podcast was a drinking game and you had to take a shot every time his name was mentioned, you'd be dead. And if you died from playing this game, he would probably blame a homosexual for killing you. Okay, just a quick spoiler here. Ranger Collins' testimony finishes out day 9. So we'll finish that out and then start next week when he begins day 10. Wait, you didn't think his testimony would fit into one day, did you? Of course not. Now, before we begin, we should all remember that when Brandon had his U.S. Constitution's 6th Amendment trampled on, Ranger Collins was one of the ones going heel to toe right on top of this historic piece of paper. Everyone that took part in the mischievous plot was supposed to be recused, yet he's still allowed to testify. It's baffling, I know. I understand, and I agree. All right. So Ranger Collins explains to the jury what Texas Rangers do, or at least what they're supposed to do. He claims to have asked the deputies to film the crime scene with the lights off to be able to demonstrate ambient light in the crime scene. Wait, film school 101? Sure. Crime scene 101? Not so much. Maybe I should bring him in as a consultant when we go to do more filming for the upcoming docuseries about this case. Oh, never mind. I forgot. He won't talk to me. Oh well. So all right, no problem. Film the crime scene with the lights off to create an ambient lighting effect or whatever. Director Collins is on the set. Then, surely they went back and actually did their investigative work and filmed it again with all the lights on this time, right? You know, so you can actually see stuff. Nope. It turns out the battery on the camera died. Oh well, move on. I'm sure there wasn't a charger around. I mean, did they even make chargers in 2005? Okay, I'm being silly. Let's move on. The prosecution allows him to verify that there was jewelry and vehicle keys all over the place, but nothing was taken. He claimed that there was moisture in the shower as though someone had recently used it. Yep. Those of us that heard earlier episodes remember this to be the case. As the testing showed, there was someone using that bathroom within, at the very most, 13 hours before they inspected the crime scene, which would be about 8 a.m. Tuesday morning. Where was Brandon? Oh yeah, airtight alibi in Abilene. Almost forgot. Oh well, again, don't let anything like an ironclad alibi stand in the way of a good homosexual whodunit. He claimed that the hair in Norma's left hand was from her own head. He was the person who moved the hand. He claimed that there were only 2 hairs in the right hand. Man, these investigators really need to get together on their stories. Is it 1 or 2, or is it 3 to 5? Maybe I should give him Joel Gibson's number. They can talk about it and maybe come up with a consistent number. So Ranger Collins says that he remembers meeting Brandon Woodruff for the first time at the Hunt County Sheriff's Office and claimed that he was wearing socks with no shoes. He believed there was a possibility his shoes were discarded out of fear of containing blood spatter, so Collins had the grounds of the Hunt County Sheriff's Office searched. No shoes were found. Funny, why didn't he just ask Brandon about it? Turns out that Brandon had accidentally left his shoes in his aunt's car that they were supposed to have traveled to Greenville in. But then they ended up taking someone else's car at the last second, and he just forgot them in the other car. It's funny how, quote, weird things have reasonable explanations when you just ask. Ranger Collins then says that he believed it was a revolver used since there were no shell casings found and the amount of gunpowder residue found on Norma. With everything added up through his training and experience, Collins believed that this was a, quote, personal homicide. This, as well as being the last person to see them alive, Mr. Lundz's testimony, Michelle Lee claiming Brandon had access to the revolver, led him to believe it was Brandon from the beginning. A student at ACU named Lindsay Ferguson had a father who worked for Dallas PD. She would be one of the students driving Brandon's truck to Texarkana. Her father distracted the students while Sneaky Pete Collins installed a tracking device. He feared Brandon would flee. He physically followed Norma's truck from the Dallas area to Texarkana. He observed the funeral to make sure that the family had no knowledge that the search in the Heath home and Brandon's dorm room were being conducted simultaneously. Wow, this sounds like actual police work. Of course, it's actual police work to try and prove his theory, not to neutrally investigate leads that come into him. Now, we've reached the interviews that we all know and love. Unfortunately, because Mike was never called as a witness, the jury doesn't get to hear his. Just imagine what the outcome of the trial would have been if they did hear it. Now we know why the prosecution never called Mike to the stand. Slick move, prosecutors. Slick move. All right, next up, Ranger Collins talks about the arrest. He says that he checked the call for service records for the Woodruffs neighborhood and found no evidence of it being, quote, bad as people had reported, Brandon said. Then he says he submitted Brandon's suitcase for blood testing, but found none. He even admitted to the inconsistencies in the phone records. But don't worry, we'll talk all about the phone records next week. And this, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the close of Day 9. We'll start next week with Day 10 and finish out the coverage of the trial. As mentioned before, we'll then have closing arguments the next week, and you'll get to hear the verdict read out loud in court. Yes, the actual recording. It's pretty chilling. We'll also get to Charla's, quote, victim impact statement in that episode as well. Okay, so until next time, remember to stay aware, stay strong, and get involved. See you next week.
And are you able to give an opinion with any degree of medical certainty as to whether or not Exhibit 153 is the weapon that inflicted the stab wounds on Dennis and Norma?
In my opinion, it's not. This isn't the weapon.
And you're giving that with a degree of medical certainty?
Yes, I am.
Thank you, Doctor.